Donald Trump strikes again, vowing to double tariffs on steel and aluminium. For the Albanese government, the challenge of dealing with an unpredictable ally just got harder. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. A big election win hasn't removed some of the big challenges facing the Albanese government. Donald Trump has flagged a further trade hit, hurting exporters and adding to global volatility. On climate change, new data shows emissions didn't go down last year, and the decision to greenlight the extension of a major gas project has raised questions about how climate targets will be met. Still, the challenges are even more confronting on the other side of politics. The coalition's back together, but the reunion looks tenuous, and disgruntled figures demoted in the frontbench shake-up are showing no signs of quietly complying.
The federal Liberals and Nationals are officially back together.
David and I will be friends.
Because we've laid the boundaries, we've laid the foundation stones.
And we can announce our new coalition shadow ministry.
Jane Hume has been dumped entirely from the ministry.
This is about putting the best team on the field. Of course it hurts.
There are probably some appointments that have not been predicated on experience or merit.
As my very wise mother would say, stop your nonsense, chin up, chest out, straighten your tiara and let's get on with the job.
When I became leader 3 years ago, that I wanted to have generational change.
Two Nationals MPs, Barnaby Joyce and Michael McCormack, will now be on the backbench.
So it's not generational change, it's politics.
You're older than him.
Yes, well, do I look it? That's the important thing.
A lot of the people are about the same age as you, and so the question around generational change is sort of... Couple older, OK, there we go.
On net zero, the coalition has said it will review that commitment to the policy.
We support net zero by 2050.
We look at energy policy as a whole going forward.
We are reviewing how we best get to net zero. That's our position.
Net zero has just got to go. And there's a big issue that I can and others can focus on.
We must be very focused on the aspirations and perspectives of metropolitan Australia.
We'll take the time to get this right.
But the focus now is on Anthony Albanese and the Labor government and holding them to account.
Well, we know that we have to deal with the challenge of climate change. You know, people who question the science need to look out their window, need to have a look at what's going on.
They have just ticked off on the biggest and dirtiest gas project that the country has ever seen.
Woodside has been given the green light to extend its Northwest Shelf project in Karratha until 2070.
This is a project that is being approved through to 2070 when my kids will be grandparents.
You cannot have a shift to renewables without having a confidence.
It's going to make the droughts worse. It's going to make the fires worse.
We need to make sure that there is security of energy supply at the same time as we support the transition, which reduces our emissions. Thanks very much.
My guest this morning is the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen. First, let's check what's making news. Donald Trump's latest trade hit is making headlines around the world. He's vowed to double tariffs to 50% on steel and aluminium imports to the United States. The Australian government has again said this is not the act of a friend and will only hurt American consumers. Miles Hexeth, the Defence Minister, has endorsed what the Nine newspapers are calling a blistering address by his US counterpart to a security dialogue in Singapore. Pete Hexeth said the US stands ready to fight and win decisively if China seeks military conflict over Taiwan, which he's warned could be imminent. Richard Miles says it was a very clear articulation of American intent. And finally, in The Guardian, extending the licence for the Northwest Shelf gas project won't help Australia's energy transition while delivering almost nothing to the national purse, according to experts. Economist Chris Richardson says the way we tax gas is a massive fail, while the Grattan Institute says the extension won't help power prices or reliability. We're going to come to the government's difficulties shortly, extracting more gas while trying to bring down emissions, trying to decipher what Donald Trump is doing on trade. We're going to start, though, with the coalition. Yes, they've had a lot of focus recently, but what's happened over the past week could determine the fate of the Liberal and National parties. They're back together, but the big policy difference over net zero remains unresolved, and some big personalities remain very unhappy about where they've landed. Let's bring the panel in. We're joined this week by Laura Tingle, Jason Katsoukas and Claire Armstrong. Very good morning to all of you. And Laura, good to have you with us here as you move from politics into the role as the ABC's Global Affairs editor, and we've got some global affairs coming up, so it's a good crossover point to have you. Let's start with your thoughts, though, on the coalition. Important week for them, but papering over a lot of differences still. Are we seeing yet any sign that the coalition generally has got the memo from the election result?
I don't think we're seeing any sign that they've got the memo from the election result. I mean, the obvious issue is net zero, David, and I was thinking about this over the weekend, and net zero is a bit like Gonski. You know, everybody said, "Oh, net zero, that's a thing. Gonski's a thing." I really support Gonski, but it's become something where people don't actually really know what it means, and it sort of doesn't mean anything. I mean, we're talking about Woodside later, but you know, that really throws the government's commitment to net zero into a bit of a question mark itself. But for the coalition, I think net zero is a sign that it wants to stick, or the Nationals and some of the Liberals want to stick with that basic issue of whether they believe in climate change, whether they believe in doing something about it. You are seeing from others the point of, OK, well, we do have to get to net zero. It's about how we get there. This is a pretty fundamental thing. It's not just a philosophical thing, but it's a political tactics issue about who you're trying to actually appeal to, and whether you've actually sort of said, well, I think we have finally moved on from the climate wars after 15 years. Well, apparently not in Nat's world.
No, and Susan Lee did say when she got the leadership that we'd moved on from the climate wars, and clearly what we're seeing in the coalition suggests otherwise. I just want to show you where they sort of landed this week, or this past week, after coming back together as a coalition. They're going to review their position on net zero. David Littleproud, however, is at the moment standing by it.
We support net zero by 2050.
We look at energy policy as a whole going forward. We have to play as a country our part in the global response to climate change, but we have to make sure that we don't do it at any cost.
I think it's interesting, right? Clearly there are risks for Susan Lee in even having the possibility out there that they might drop net zero, might walk away from it. But on the other hand, Jason, is having a review maybe the best way to bring the coalition together? Sure, you're never going to win over Barnaby Joyce, Matt Canavan. They'll keep arguing against net zero. But does having some sort of process around, OK, here's how we've settled the position, mean that the rest of them need to back it?
Well, I think Susan Lee shouldn't be afraid to have a fight about this. You know, this is a fight for the future of the Liberal Party. And I think she's got to sort that out by having as vigorous a policy discussion as needs to be. And just sort of trying to paper over the differences and have unity, which is what Peter Dutton strove for, didn't get them anywhere. So I think Susan Lee's got to really accept that she's got a fight on her hands and not be afraid to take that fight up to those who oppose net zero. If she wants to bring the party to the centre, they're going to have to keep net zero. They can't win metropolitan seats without that policy. And I think she's got to prosecute that argument and has to win it.
I think that's right, but it can't drag on forever, right? Because they need to settle this relatively quickly if they want to look credible.
Well, you'd think that she's got at least a year to 18 months, and then we get into the second half of the term, and you'd want it settled by then. But I don't think it's too much of a worry for her to have a fight in the first year.
I think she has two false starts to learn from as well. If you look back to 21, the way that Morrison achieved that agreement in support of net zero was essentially then the plan behind it to reach, the technology plan behind it had these huge gaping holes that really made no sense. Then you had Peter Dutton do the inverse, where he almost didn't talk about the end result and exclusively talked about the mechanism, which was nuclear. You know, I think it's kind of proof that neither works. You actually do need to settle the question of net zero, but with a very firm how to get there kind of policy.
And isn't there a sort of an associated issue here? One of them is about the actual policy, and one of them is about that very question about whether they're going to keep letting the tail wag the dog. I mean, I don't think Susan Lee really has any political choice except to say, come on, bring it on. No, I'm not moving. If you want to leave, fine. I mean, the coalition's numbers are so terrible. If, you know, half the Nationals decide that they're going to leave the party, you know, whatever. But I don't think the Liberals, as Jason says, or Susan Lee can afford to do anything other than smile sweetly and saying, sorry, mate, but, you know, we've got to move on.
Yeah.
You know.
On the shadow ministry, clearly there were some unhappy at the outcome. And the big surprise, I suppose, was Jane Hume. Yes, she has worn the blame for the work from home debacle during the campaign. But dropping her entirely from the front bench, someone who I think previously had been seen as one of their better performers, was a surprise, and she didn't hide her disappointment.
You know, it hurts professionally because I was such a hard-working and prolific and high-profile member of the front bench in the previous opposition, and it hurts personally too because, you know, Susan and I are friends. There is something very liberating about being on the backbench and being able to speak without having to stick to the party line and without having to stick to talking points.
She certainly was a leading moderate, remains a moderate, didn't end up backing Susan Lee, though, for the leadership over various concerns. Why was she dropped like this?
She essentially, I mean, the coalition like to make a lot of the Labor faction system, but she essentially ended up friendless by being, quite literally ordained as the co-leader of the moderates a few months ago, to then go into the leadership ballot very much in support of Angus, the right candidate. And at the end of the day, when Susan Lee is rewarding supporters and keeping those who didn't, keeping her enemies close, it would have been untenable to members of the right part of the coalition that Jane get one of their sort of positions in cabinet because she was essentially an opponent of Susan in the leadership ballot. Just as it was untenable to the moderates that Jane get to maintain her position, given she had effectively gone against where her faction ultimately went in that ballot.
This always happens, right? You reward your supporters, that happens in politics, Laura. But is this an example of, leaving someone with merit completely out of the front bench?
Look, I'm really sorry, but she stuffed up during the campaign.
Sure. Yeah.
And if you look at what the signals are, the factional issues are always, at play, and it is always politics. But was there anybody who was dumped or demoted who you'd think they really deserved to be there, over all other considerations? And when you think about the signals that the overall structure of the front bench sends to the public, basically, they've dumped a lot of hardliners, I would say, or people who haven't performed, which might sort of seem very brutal, but that's the way it is. And I think the signals that it sends are actually, probably the right ones. Even though we've obviously got less women, I think overall, it's either people who've been conspicuously, associated with a stuff up, or who've been seen to be too hardline. And I think that's probably the sort of signal that Susan Lee needs to be sending.
But 4 women dropped from the shadow cabinet. They've got less women. I mean, is that the right signal?
Well, sorry, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. I'm all for equal representation, but the Liberal Party never really has been, has it? I think it only raises the question that they need more women in the joint party room
to choose from. Look, one of those women dropped from the shadow cabinet, but still in the shadow ministry, in the outer shadow ministry, is of course Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, and she wasn't too thrilled either.
I'll be honest to say that there are probably some appointments that have not been predicated on experience or merit. But this is the team we have to work with, that we're working with going forward. And I'm not going to lie and say that I'm not disappointed that I'm not within cabinet itself.
She was seen as very effective in leading the no case in the Voice referendum and very popular with the base, but the arguments internally against Jacinta Price are when she says things on abortion or make Australia great again, that there's this tendency to create problems for them, Jason. But is that going to be a problem for Susan Lee, having that sort of attitude in her shadow ministry?
Well, I think it's maybe more of a problem for Senator Price. I mean, she's certainly not trying to make friends on either side of the coalition. She is seen by the Nationals as a turncoat. Yep. She came into the Liberal Party room saying that she'd run for deputy. She had been there 5 minutes. Now she's got a front bench position, but she's complaining about it. And she's also sort of cast doubt on the the merits of the whole front bench by saying,
yeah, who's
well,
she talking about there when she says there's some there that don't deserve to be there?
And I think a lot of her colleagues would be thinking, well, is she talking about me, and reflecting sort of poorly on their abilities. So I don't think it helps her at all. I think it's not too much of a worry for Susan Lee, because Jacinta Price has created so many enemies. I think that Susan Lee looks probably better by doing this.
Very dangerous for her to be leaning straight to experience as a main qualifier for the front bench, given that she had been in Parliament about 12 months when she was first elevated to Shadow Cabinet by Peter Dutton. But there's a broader issue at play here, which is that Jacinta has sort of bet the house on this big shift to the Liberal Party. Obviously, the Angus Taylor not winning the leadership battle meant she decided not to run for deputy, but she now has a problem where the Country Liberal Party in the Northern Territory really don't want to pre-select her for the Senate, which obviously comes up at every election for Territorians. If she can't get pre-selected in that Senate seat, then she's in a lot of trouble in terms of finding a home. And there's a belief among both her detractors and supporters that a challenge has to happen. She has to get that deputy Liberal position at some point in the next 3 years, because that will be insurance against
that protects
having
her pre-selection.
Yeah,
that's interesting, because she can't go back to the Nats, you wouldn't think. And finding a Liberal lower house seat to run in, there ain't
far between at the moment.
those that look promising at the moment. All right, well, let's leave the coalition there for now. Time to talk to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen. To take us there, here's a look at how Australia is progressing towards net zero. The latest emissions data was released by the Climate Change Department on Friday, and you can see how emissions have steadily fallen over the last 20 years. A lot of that driven by changes to land clearing. Friday's figures show a flatlining for last year. In fact, overall emissions went up just slightly over the course of 2024 by 0.05%. Emissions in the industrial sector fell by 5%. They also fell by 2% in agriculture due to lower crop production. Electricity sector emissions rose by more than 2% and also rose in the transport sector. Chris Bowen, welcome to the program.
Thanks for inviting me on, David.
So is the target of reducing emissions by 43% by 2030 now looking more difficult to achieve?
Well, it's never been easy, but we are by and large on track. And last year I released all the forecasts. But in relation to the figures you just mentioned, I describe them as mixed. We had a couple of releases of figures this week. Renewable energy for the first quarter, very strong, very encouraging, very pleasing. But those emissions figures that you referred to for 2024, obviously there are some areas that are encouraging, like industrial emissions, way down and lower than 2021, for example. Transport continues to be a challenge. And I guess I'd say, David, that it's a reminder that when we do take action, it can work, like industry. Traditionally, a lot of Australia's emissions reductions come from the land sector, and as La Nina's coming to an end, that has reduced. And it's a reminder that we need to do more. So take transport, for example. Now, our new vehicle efficiency standards only came into force on the 1st of January, for example. I wouldn't pretend they've yet had an impact. It was a controversial issue at the election with a choice for the Australian people, where we said we'll keep going, the Liberals said they'd stop. So these are the sorts of things that we need to keep going on to ensure that we can achieve and will achieve a 43% emissions reduction, which I'm very confident we can and will.
Yeah, and part of that, of course, is having 82% renewables by 2030. A lot of people in industry say one of the problems they're facing in rolling out renewables is the approvals process, the environmental approvals to get big wind farms, solar farms up. Is that something that you'll fix?
Well, firstly, let me say again, we're making good progress there. 15 gigawatts added since we came to office. That's 3 snowy hydro schemes added in capacity since we came to office. So there's a lot happening. On planning approvals, yeah, we are continuing to work on that. I guess to say a couple of things. We've put more money into the environment side of my portfolio to get faster approvals or rejections, faster yes or no, as is appropriate. We're also working with the states. Only about 20% of renewable applications come to the Federal Minister for approval. We're working with the states, and we have renewable energy transformation agreements with every state except for Queensland. And part of that is ensuring that the planning system is fit for purpose at the state level. And I'm working very closely with my state energy minister colleagues to ensure that's the case. And they're making good progress as well.
OK, so you will hit the 2030 target in your view?
Well, on both targets, if you look at 82%, again, very encouraging figures in the last quarter. We're now at 46% renewables in the last quarter last year and 43% in the first quarter this year. It moves from quarter to quarter. And again, 15 gigawatts. That's 3 snowy hydros added since we came to office, and a big pipeline of investment coming through. So yes, the 82% target does have challenges. I never suggested that it's a linear line and it all happens easily or it's all automatic. But with the right policy settings, which we do have, and the right approach from government, yes, we can continue to be on track, facing headwinds and challenges from time to time, of course. But we're seeing very strong investment figures.
I want to ask you about the next target, which will be the 2035 climate target that you need to set in the coming months. When will you announce that, and how ambitious should we expect you to be?
Well, let's deal with the ambition first. It'll be ambitious and achievable. It's got to be both those things. And David, in Australia, we have, if I say so myself, I think world's best practice for setting the climate target. It's based in our Climate Change Act. Together with the United Kingdom, we have a what's well regarded around the world as the best process, with independent advice which comes to me, and then I take to the Cabinet and we work through, and that advice, if the government hasn't followed it, is released and it's transparent all to see. Released either way, whether we follow it or not. That's really good process. Now, the UNFCCC has asked countries to set their targets by September. Of course, that's what we'll do, but we won't do it a day before we're ready, not before I've received the advice from the Climate Change Authority, which they're still working on. Then I'll consider it, take it through Cabinet, and it'll be transparent for all to see. One
of the reasons why the Climate Change Authority and its chair, Matt Keane, has delayed the advice is because of Donald Trump. He's pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and his administration boasts about driving a dagger through the heart of climate change religion. Does this also change your thinking about where Australia should go with its target?
Well, it is one of the things that the Climate Change Authority's asked for more time on, because it's got implications across the board. If the Inflation Reduction Act falls, and that means there's less reductions in the cost of capital, but also that capital's got to go somewhere, and Australia will be a welcoming and inviting home to that renewable energy investment.
But on the 2035 target, does Donald Trump change your thinking?
Well, again, it's one of many factors that the Climate Change Authority is thinking about, and the Cabinet will think about when we put it in, when we put it through, because we do need to consider international circumstances. About the United States, I mean, let me make this point. The United States is around 12% of emissions globally. That's a lot, but it doesn't mean that the rest of the 88% of us stop doing things. So we do take into account the United States, but fundamentally, our government will always act in the Australian national interest, and that means seizing the economic opportunities which come from action on climate change, building our capacity for renewable energy. Net zero, for example, has been endorsed by the vast majority, the majority of the world's emitting countries, Australia included, and it remains in our economic best interests as the Morrison government. You heard it here first. I agree with the Morrison government. As the Morrison government pointed out, it's very much in Australia's economic best interest.
But just on that, if the US is walking away from net zero and if others aren't doing enough when it comes to climate change, I know you've been looking at the option of Australia imposing a carbon tariff or a carbon border adjustment mechanism, as the Europeans are looking at. What's your thinking on that at the moment?
Well, we've been, again, clear that we want to ensure Australian industry is best placed to compete in a decarbonising world. And Australian industry has a lot to bring to the table, as the world's investors and consumers and insurers and boards require decarbonisation plans. And we've been working with industry, big industry, to ensure that's the case. Now, in relation to how we can best compete, as you know, I commissioned Professor Frank Iozzo last year to advise the government. He's made public consultation papers. Those papers make clear he thinks the settings are right in the short term, but there are things we can think about in the medium to long term. And obviously that's something I'll continue to progress this term with my Cabinet colleagues, looking at how we do that, how we can best ensure that Australian industry, as it decarbonises, can compete.
So a carbon tariff is still a prospect?
Well, I think I'd urge against sweeping generalisations about policy settings, and what could be the case is obviously we look at particular sectors first, around cement and lime are places that we've looked at in particular. But again, I'm not going to get in front of a process. We asked Professor Iozzo to look at this. He's been doing excellent work, consulting Australian industry very heavily. I've had lots of meetings with steel makers and cement makers about these things over the past 12 months, for example, getting their feedback. And we'll have more to say during the course of this term.
All right. Speaking of tariffs, I need to ask you about Donald Trump's decision, his announcement yesterday that he's going to increase the tariff on steel and aluminium imported to the United States to 50%. How will Australia respond to this?
Well, we'll respond by standing up for Australian industry, as the Prime Minister and the Trade Minister and all of us have done all through. This is not the act of a friend, and we'll call that out. The United States is not acting as a friend of Australia in this move, but we'll continue to make the case. An observer, an impartial observer would say the United States hasn't been entirely consistent with every comment they've announced. That sometimes the policy has changed. We'll continue to advocate for a change in policies to support Australian industry.
Well, yeah, indeed, it might change again in the coming weeks. But would Australia consider a challenge in the World Trade Organisation over these tariffs?
Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm sure we will consider all options available to defend the best interest of Australian industry. So that is an option? Well, self-evidently it's an option, but I'm not going to preempt discussions. The first port of call is to make the strongest possible representations at all levels to the United States and hope that we can avoid the issue in the first place. Let's come back to climate, though. Now, if Donald Trump is influencing the decision on the 2035 target, you said Cabinet would consider what he's doing on climate as you set your 2035 target. Do you understand the coalition also now wanting to revisit the 2050 net zero target? No. No, because net zero is the essential starting point. Let me make 3 points. I've already made the point about the United States being 12% of emissions. That's point one. Point two, net zero by 2050 was set out by the IPCC as the minimum action required to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. I mean, if you're not for net zero, you're for the catastrophic impacts of climate change. We've got to remind ourselves of the why. And then the third point is that this remains in Australia's economic best interests. When Scott Morrison gave Australia the policy of net zero by 2050, he pointed out it would be economically beneficial for Australia and for Australians. And he was right to do so. And even if it wasn't an obligation, it would remain the right economic policy for Australia. Dan Tehan used to think that when he was Trade Minister. I hope he still thinks that as Climate Change Shadow Minister. But it is very fundamentally the case. I understand a political party after an election defeat reviewing policies and maybe the how, but not the why and not the whether. What the Liberal Party is showing really here is that they are not comfortable with modern Australia and the economic challenges facing modern Australia. All right, well, given your firm commitment there to net zero, let me move to the decision. Your colleague, the Environment Minister's conditional approval during the week of an extension of the North West Shelf gas project. This will extend this gas project from 2030 out to 2070. How does extracting gas for another 40 years help Australia reach net zero? Well, again, this facility that Minister Watt, against the very strict criteria of the environmental approvals legislation, has approved, against that very strict criteria that he's legally obliged to consider, is responsible for about 1.4% of Australia's emissions. It's our 13th biggest facility, 13th biggest emitting facility, behind 10 coal-fired power stations and 2 other gas facilities, for example. So it's significant, but should also be seen in that broader context and the things that we've just talked about. But those coal plants will be gone by 2050. This will remain. And this will be legally obliged and required under our safeguard mechanism to meet net zero by 2050. It already is. It's already obliged to be reducing its net emissions today, and it is. And again, I mean, we referred to some of those reductions in emissions that we're seeing partly because of our safeguard reforms, which cover this facility. Now, of course, we've always said gas has a role to play for Australia and the world. It's a flexible, firming support for renewable energy. There's lots of heavy industry that currently relies on gas, and we're working very hard to see green hydrogen come up as a replacement, but it's not there yet. No. So we have to take an approach here which reflects the realities, but also does not, for a second, step away from our obligations or our ambitions. Well, I was going to ask you about how the safeguards mechanism applies to this project, because extending it beyond 2030, what happens? Does Woodside need to get this project down to net zero emissions somehow itself? Yes. Yes, in effect, all the facilities covered, the more than 200 facilities covered by the safeguard mechanism, are obliged to have a pathway to net zero by 2050. So how do they do that? Should they use renewables to turn the gas into LNG? Options. They have options, and those options include on-site emissions abatement, and there are investments that they can make. And partly the whole idea of the safeguard mechanism is to send the message to the boards to say, hey, you should start investing in on-site emissions abatement here, because we're going to require you to buy offsets if you don't. And it sends that signal, and that is already having an impact. In the first year of operations of the safeguard reforms that we put into place, we've seen on-site emissions reduced by an equivalent amount of around 30% of Australia's domestic aviation. And that's the first year. Now, there's a long way to go. I'm not saying it's all done. I'm not saying it's all easy in all cases, but we are starting to see the impact of the sorts of policies, the well-calibrated, well-designed, careful, balanced policies of the first term. And as I've indicated in answer to your first question, more to do in the second term.
Well, this extension of the North West Shelf project now makes the much bigger Browse Basin gas field to the north more viable to develop because it would use the same infrastructure. If that were to get the green light, the Browse Basin, that would have a big impact on Australia's emissions, wouldn't it?
Well, they are separate but related approvals. So Minister Watt has not approved that.
No.
That's Browse, you're right, there's connections, but it is 900 kilometres away. It has its own challenges to overcome, both in terms of economics and environmental approvals. They're quite separate matters. I do think this is a very legitimate debate. I understand.
But there'd be an emissions impact, is the question. There would be an emissions impact for Australia.
Well, of course there would be, but again, Browse would be covered by all our existing domestic legislation and requirements. Now, when we introduced that, it was very controversial. The opposition opposed us.
So it would have to be net zero as well.
There were people in the industry who opposed me and the government about introducing those reforms. And yes, as I said, the safeguard reforms puts our big emitters on a pathway through reductions of 4.9% a year on a pathway to net zero by 2050.
Does approving gas projects extending North West Shelf, for example, make it harder for you in trying to win the Global Climate Summit to be hosted in Australia next year? You want to host the COP Summit. Does these sort of gas approvals make your task of winning votes harder?
Well, decisions like that are always going to be controversial on both sides, domestically and internationally. I don't deny that. But we'll always set Australia's domestic policy in Australia's domestic best interest, not because of a COP bid or anything else.
Right.
Now, in the COP bid, we're getting very strong support. I'm very pleased with the amount of support. There's a great opportunity for our country. Restores Australia's leadership in climate against the bad years of the decade of denial and delay. Shows we're back in a very meaningful way.
You need to get Turkey out of the way, though, wouldn't you? Out of the race.
And yes, there's two bidders, Adelaide and Ankara, Turkey in Australia. And we're getting very, very strong support for our bid. I'm hopeful that it's resolved very soon because the South Australian government and we have a lot of planning to do to deliver a conference which knocks it out of the park. Is our intention for Australia to showcase ourselves as a renewable energy powerhouse, to highlight the jobs opportunities for a traditional fossil fuel country like ours, that we can and will embrace the transition, and we have things to share and things to learn with the rest of the world.
The issue is we're still a gas powerhouse as well, and we're going to be a gas powerhouse for some time to come. Can I just finish with a question on gas, and that's the idea of an East Coast gas reservation, which is being talked about a bit over recent days. Is that in the government's thinking, or can you just use the existing mechanism that you have to keep more Australian gas here?
Well, let me make just a few brief points, David. We've already added a lot of domestic gas. That was necessary, 640 petajoules to the reforms that Madeleine King and I have been responsible for. That's a much more effective delivery of domestic gas than the boondoggle that the coalition took to the last election. Now, we've made clear we've got a number of policies that are up for review. It's about, they're coming to their review time, the gas mechanism, the gas code, etc. We'll look at those and see what more can be done. The Prime Minister's made clear when we need to do more, we will do more. But let's be clear, we've not only thought that Australian gas should be provided to Australian industry and Australian households, we've acted on it and delivered. Again, not always uncontroversial, opposed by some in the sector, opposed by the opposition, but absolutely vital to ensure the supply of gas to our small number of gas-fired power stations, to heavy industry that needs it, and to those Australians who use gas to heat their homes.
OK, but you're not going to do anything retrospective, as the coalition proposed at the election?
Well, no, we have a very clear matter of principle that we don't agree with sovereign risk. We don't agree with retrospective policy actions. We act accordingly and I think that should be uncontroversial. That is good governance.
Chris Bowen, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David. And can I just very briefly add my words to the many hundreds that have been said about Laura Tingle and pay tribute to her outstanding service, and we're all looking forward to the next chapter. She is a doyen of Australian journalism and rightly much celebrated.
Yeah. Chris Bowen, thank you very much for those kind remarks as well.
Thank you.
All right, well, coming up, we're going to turn to Donald Trump's latest trade move and how Australia is handling all of that. Let's get back to the panel. Laura Tingle, Jason Katsoukas and Claire Armstrong. And Embarrass you a lot here this morning, Laura. Now you can just, in a very straight way, tell us what you thought of Chris Bowen's interview just then. Look, just on gas, right? So this is really interesting. I think he's saying there that Woodside, sure, they've got the green light to keep going with North West Shelf, but they are going to have to get down to net zero under the safeguards mechanism. Exactly how quickly that works and how they do it, but that's significant, I suppose.
It is significant, I think. There's a lot of debate about the PBC Act, which is the one that Murray Watt approved this under, and the fact that it doesn't have a specific mechanism on climate. It's really, I mean, there is, potentially the capacity to knock something back on climate grounds, but not really.
No, it's more looking at the impact on the rock art and other local issues.
Very, very localised stuff. But the question then becomes, what other mechanisms have they got to actually sort of force Woodside and the partners to really, do something about emissions? Now, as he says, there's been some things done under the mechanism to reduce emissions, but it's not enough. It's not entirely clear what's going to happen. And I think the really big question out of this decision is, what does this do to blow out our emissions and therefore our targets? I mean, some people have estimated that a decade's worth of emissions from the North West Shelf, could just completely blow out our emissions. So
but this gets
we need something a bit more specific, and that's before you get to browse, of course.
No, before the bigger field that they haven't yet approved. But Jason, this gets to, I guess there's often a confusion around, there's a lot of gas, but it's shipped off to Japan and South Korea, and it's used there, and that doesn't count in our domestic emissions. That counts in those third countries, or Japan and South Korea, those countries. What does count in our emissions profile is the emissions caused by actually extracting the gas, turning it into LNG, and so on.
That's right, and I think there is an argument though that Australia should start taking responsibility for the fossil fuels that it exports overseas.
Scope 3 emissions. Yeah.
Indeed. But yes, and whether or not it adds to the production adds to our own greenhouse gas emissions, yes, that's part of it. But I think in the long term, Australia has to start thinking about the impact that its fossil fuels do have on the rest of the world. And so there's sort of a little bit of, the government is kind of weaseling out of this a little bit there by trying to absolve themselves.
It's only one planet, right? That's at the end of the day, but it's how different countries are trying to get to net zero. And clearly, Claire, the Albanese government thinks it can get there. We're still using quite a lot of gas.
Yeah, there's a few things to unpack with how the government is trying to get to its emissions reductions targets. I'm not sure how long it will take, but eventually they're going to have to recognise that we are not getting to 82% renewables in this country by 2030. I think it requires something like
Chris
a doubling
Bowen thinks we will.
Roughly a doubling of the current amount of renewables over 5 years, particularly when you've got states like Queensland cancelling massive renewables projects, like they've just cancelled a big wind farm project. So I think there's kind of two things happening here. One is it's pretty clear that the government is going all in on gas as a firming power to support that rapid expansion of renewables. But what isn't really being talked about in a realistic sense is, are we even going to get to that point with renewables? Because if not, then you're talking about gas far less as a firming backup kind of supply, as more, and turning it to be more as an always-on sort of supply.
Yeah, I mean, there's a firm view from the gas industry, Laura, and increasingly you hear this from the government as well, don't you, that gas is going to speed up the transition because, you've got an aluminium smelter that really wants to go renewables but needs to have gas to help it get there.
Look, this is all a little bit cute, I think, David. I mean, the Prime Minister was linking the North West Shelf project with the Tomago aluminium smelter this week, and of course,
they're not using that gas.
The North West Shelf doesn't provide any gas to the East Coast, and as Claire says, not only have there been a reduction in renewables projects, and generally, the sort of unsaid thing is that renewables aren't happening as fast as the government would like. But this week in Queensland, there was a huge opening up of areas for exploration for gas as well, and the language of the Labor Party has shifted on gas, from being sort of it's a sort of a backup to being something that we really need in sort of as a major source of energy, which was sort of the position I think we were at with the Morrison government. Yeah. So their language has shifted, but at the same time, of course, we've got this different discussion going on about how you do something about prices, which of course nobody's talking about cost of living much anymore, have you noticed? So we've got talk about a domestic gas reservation on the East Coast, which I think is fascinating. Madeleine King this week was talking about, warning companies that they're going to need to look at their social licence, hint, hint, that means that they're going to have to provide more gas on the East Coast.
Technically, they can use the trigger that they already have. They could actually pull that trigger, which I don't know if they have. They've sat down with the gas companies each year and, convinced them to provide a certain amount of gas to the domestic market. But that Australian domestic gas security mechanism does give them the ability to go further. They won't go retrospective though, as Chris Bowen said. Just on the North West Shelf though, I just want to talk about the timing here. This was delayed until after the election, this decision. And you can see why Labor clearly didn't want to make this announcement before the election. The Greens, furious about it.
What this decision today does show is just how broken Australia's environment laws are. That it is totally open and accessible for the Environment Minister to give environmental approval to something that is clearly going to trash Australia's environment and trash our climate.
Laura, this comes to the point around what the current environment law allows the Minister, Murray Watt, to do. He can't look at the climate, he can only look at those other environmental impacts. But these laws, we know the government's going to try and rework, and the Greens will be pushing to put a climate trigger into the approvals law. I don't think Labor's too keen to go there though.
Well, I think that they really will have to think about it. But of course, what they've done now is the biggest possible project has now got clearance.
Yep.
So the timing of that is quite good. They can now move on the EPBC, and it won't affect the North West Shelf. A cynic would say, David. But I think it's very hard for them not to go harder on the EPBC, given the debacle it became under the last government, where they talked so big and then did so little. And everybody agrees, business, environmentalists, everybody agrees the system is broken and it needs a really fundamental rethink. And to pussyfoot around, I think, is just not worth the effort.
Let's turn to Donald Trump. Yesterday, he visited a steel plant just outside of Pittsburgh, and he announced that he's going to go even further on the steel and aluminium tariffs.
We are going to be imposing a 25% increase. We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America, which will even further secure the steel industry in the United States. Nobody's going to get around that.
Now, for those trying to keep up, and it can be a little confusing because it's constantly changing, the courts in the US the other day knocked out the Liberation Day tariffs, and then an appeals court said, hang on, you can keep them in place until we hear an appeal. They're separate to the steel and aluminium tariffs, right, which will now be 50%. And the reaction from the Australian government, you heard a bit of it from Chris Bowen, but he was the Trade Minister too.
We're going to do exactly what we did with China. We're going to coolly and calmly argue our case for the removal of these tariffs.
I'll tell you what exactly they did with China, Claire. They took China to the World Trade Organization, didn't they, on the wine sanctions?
Yes, and a big part of the argument was also based on the fact that we were being individually targeted by China, whereas these aluminium or the steel tariffs as well apply to all of the imports into America. I don't think Australia is going to have any success in pursuing this issue the way that they did with China, particularly because at the time the WTO, like the looming decision that was clearly going to go Australia's way, was an incentive for China to wait till the very last minute, but ultimately remove those tariffs.
But Trump doesn't care
that
about
is
WTO,
not going to be
right?
something that Trump
So
responds to.
what does, Anthony Albanese is due to meet Donald Trump in a couple of weeks. It's expected on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Canada. What does he say?
I think he just continues with the approach that the government's taken so far with Trump's tariffs, quietly behind the scenes trying to advance Australia's case. There's no point making a public fuss about it. That's not going to make any progress, or it's not going to help convince Donald Trump. And I think the government showed that it was very well prepared when Trump had his Liberation Day tariff announcements. They handled that very well, I think. And I think that's the approach they're going to take this time. It's not personal, it's not only directed at Australia, so I don't think there's any political damage to the Albanese government on this. Slow and steady is going to be the best approach.
Yeah, and I understand Anthony Albanese is not desperate to make a side trip to Washington and sit down in the Oval Office after what happened to Zelensky and Ramaphosa. You don't want to be part of that reality TV show, do you?
You don't want to be part of that show. And, yes, it is a universal measure. It doesn't hit us that hard. And I think there's been a general shift around the world from people going, oh my God, what's he doing, to the taco, what is it?
Yes, Trump always chickens out, taco.
Well, a couple of interesting facts. Imports into the US slumped 20% last month. Now, that was partly, which is extraordinary, the biggest slump on record. But of course, that was partly because they'd gone up the previous month because everybody had been racing to get stuff in before the tariffs took on. The thing that feels like will ultimately affect Donald Trump is the impact on the American economy of all of this wacky stuff.
I was reading this morning, steel prices have gone up in the US since January, 16%, right? So Anthony Albanese and others are right. This is hurting the American consumer.
Yeah. And, of course, he actually imposed tariffs on steel last time around, and he sort of essentially conceded it in his speech the other day, which is, it had no impact on steel production in America that anybody could notice. So, if you're not going to get the steel production, even with this Nippon Steel deal, which could take a while, if you're going to have this uncertainty and whiplash effect in the US economy, that's going to have much more impact than Anthony Albanese and Don Farrell saying, oh, hey, what about us?
Yes, we're good mates. Meanwhile, the US Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, has been at this Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, and he's been telling allies in this region, including Australia, that we need to increase defence spending.
NATO members are pledging to spend 5% of their GDP on defence, even Germany. So it doesn't make sense for countries in Europe to do that while key allies in Asia spend less on defence in the face of an even more formidable threat.
And Richard Marles met Pete Hegseth on the sidelines of that summit, and he's open to increasing defence spending.
And I would say this was done in a very respectful and dignified way, and we understand it, and we're very much up for that conversation.
Respectful, dignified way, Laura?
Look, the thing that strikes me is Pete Hegseth is ramping up the aggressive language on Taiwan to the US, which I find a little bit alarming. We haven't heard a lot from the Americans about this until now, about the region. And at the same time, sort of basically saying we've all got to spend more money. Now, we have a debate to be had about spending more money and what we spend it on within that defence budget. At the moment, it's all being committed to American submarines. It's not to actually having troops on the ground and short-term interests. So we've got that debate, but I find it a bit alarming that the Americans are sort of ramping up the hostility in the region. At the same time, they're saying, well, it's up to you, it's up to all of you to actually put the money in.
Yeah, so our defence spending at the moment is about 2% of GDP. It's due to get to 2.3 in about 8 years' time. Clearly the government is open to going further, but I understand the Prime Minister's not into these sort of percentage numbers. You sort of buy what you need to buy rather than set the figure as a percentage of GDP.
I think it's such an arbitrary conversation, and it's gotten beyond ridiculous. I mean, look at what the coalition took to the election, which was just a number on a piece of paper saying this is the dollar figure that we need to get to because the US and others are saying as much. There was no plan for what to spend it on at all, and I don't think it makes us more safe having a bigger target that we spend toward. I mean, if the US does want us to spend more money on defence, as Laura says, they could remove some of those hurdles that we're facing around getting access to the things we bought through AUKUS. There's no guarantee we're even going to get those submarines on the timeline that was originally agreed to, and part of that is because of the production capability in the US. So it's in their interest to get us to a position where we can even spend the money we've already committed.
And it also it also just seems pretty crazy to be ramping up the rhetoric about Taiwan when most strategic analysts would really question whether the Americans had any capacity to do anything about it in their own right, as things currently stand.
Yeah, it's also nearly triple what we're spending on defence now, and I wonder, how much would Australian taxpayers tolerate? How much more money would they tolerate being spent on defence? That's an enormous increase on what we're spending now, and I'm just not sure.
And how much would Jim Chalmers tolerate as he tries to get the budget, out of deficit?
That's right.
But clearly, this argument about whether we set a particular number, a percentage of GDP, it doesn't, rule out the reality that we will need to be spending more, whether it's on drones or missiles or some of these, AUKUS arrangements as well. If we, that's what's happening around the world and the region. Pete Hegseth's comments are alarming, but it's a reality, isn't it, that what we're facing?
But Australia it's more than just spending money on defence. Australia, as a partner of the US, we provide a lot of other benefits. I think the US has about 4 different bases and facilities here in Australia.
Well, this is
enormous advantage to the US.
And this is where the PM has a point, which is essentially you have to figure out what it is you actually want that's going to be beneficial to your capability. Go out and buy it, negotiate the best price, but don't just set the price as the goal and figure out how to fill in the rest.
Yeah, no, exactly. All right, our panel, Claire Armstrong, Jason Katsoukas, Laura Tingle, back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for the New Daily. I'm talking pictures this morning with comedian and broadcaster and the true star of Utopia, the one and only Limo, and a very warm welcome.
Thank you. I will take the credit.
Is there another series?
Well, season 6, 7 and 8 have already played out in real time in Australian politics this year, so stay tuned. I'm sure we'll be up to season 12 by the end of 2025.
It turns out that the Libs, they didn't break up.
And I think Mills and Boone, the perfect reference here from Mark Knight. And for your younger audience, we also see Farmer Wants a Wife.
Coalition Passion rekindles. They're racing through the wheat field here, I think.
They are indeed.
I don't know about Mills and Boone. If they don't get it right, it'll be Spills and Boone, won't it?
What they have to understand is you don't have to love each other to be in a good relationship. Rachel McAdams and Ryan Gosling made The Notebook. They did not like each other at all. Magic together.
Peter Brolman has got them. They've obviously had a little bit of counselling here. Relationships Australia, it's politics. Your guess is as good as mine. It's like that couple you don't like going out with because you just know they're on the edge of a fight.
God, this is going to kick off soon, isn't it?
I know.
Let's make it work for the kids.
For the kids. This is a beautiful David Rowe cartoon. It's got David Littleproud and it's only half of the Panto horse.
And of course it's Barnaby ruining it.
Yeah, I know it's you, Barnaby. As Susan Lee is giddy up there.
I'm getting visions of The Godfather. Is David Littleproud going to wake up with Barnaby as the horse's head in his bed?
I love the little Angus Taylor tank here in the background. Lovely David MacArthur. Poor old Barnaby's never going to live down the lie down in Lonsdale Street, is he? It's a swindle.
But he looks quite comfortable in that position. I think he just needs the mobile phone up to his ear.
This is a really good Matt Golding cartoon. This is just what you need. A couple of former leaders who are time bombs ticking away on the backbench.
This really is now, with them on the back bench, it's a case of get your popcorn, sit down and enjoy the show, because despite the fact that he's on the back bench with Michael McCormick here, it will kick off.
The North West Shelf gas project, Limo, is a gas, it seems, as Murray Watt has burst onto the scene.
Yeah, he's been Environment Minister for less than a month.
Yeah.
And his opening gambit is mining.
Lovely Kathy Wilcox with, it's got the recto verso.
Yes.
On one side, Woodside North West Shelf gas project proudly extended for 40 years by the Albanese government. And on the back, the survivability of earth and preservation of ancient Aboriginal rock art knowingly curtailed by the Albanese government. in 2025.
No need to read between the lines there because it has been said beautifully.
Megan Herbert has got them sandbagging with things like short-term politics, carbon offsets and abuse of the mandate.
A beautiful collection of all the arguments against.
Mate, a beautiful David Rowe. He's got Albo and Muzzers cooking with gas. You've got to burn political capital sometime.
And they're wearing the yes aprons.
Yep.
Finally, Albo got a yes vote through. And I love the cameo.
Yeah, Meg
from
O'Neill.
Meg O'Neill. She would have a sore hand from all the high fives she's received over the past week.
Glenn Lever packs a lot into his sort of minimalist drawing, Limo, doesn't he?
I mean, Albo here trying to strike a balance between making some money on the mining sector, because we love money, with the demands of protecting the environment, and which has been beautifully captured there.
The government has proposed some changes to super, but some people think it's too taxing.
You know, we don't tax rich companies, so why should we tax rich people?
Well, exactly right. Lovely Johannes Leek. Pluck away, Jim. It's not hissing anymore. They've killed the golden goose here, I think.
They have indeed. And poor old Jim Chalmers. Look at the teeth he's been handed here.
I know. Fiona Katauskas has Henny Penny, I think, here.
The sky is falling. Then over here, looks like someone's got more than 3 million in super.
Yeah.
When I first saw this, I thought, I didn't realise Disney was so generous with their super.
It'd be Henny Many Penny.
Indeed it would.
There's no shortage of material at the moment. It's been a great pleasure unpicking this week's events, and I'll let you do the honours.
Thank you, Mike, and we must say thank you to Australian Politics for continuing to deliver. Spearsy, back to you in the studio.
Thank you very much, Limo. Thank you, Mike. Now, just before we hear some final observations on last week's program, there was a suggestion 2 Nationals MPs had left their electorates during the floods in New South Wales. Alison Penfold and Pat Conahan were in fact in their electorates helping their communities. We apologise for the error. It's always important to admit when you've got something wrong. All right, let's get some final observations. Claire.
I'm going to heap on the embarrassment just quickly and thank Laura for blazing a trail through the gallery for a lot of young women like myself that have followed in the years since. But in terms of observations, this one's a bit inside baseball, but the government is still hashing out its staffing allocations. This is something that starts at the Prime Ministerial level, goes through to the Minister's offices, to the opposition and then the crossbench. It means a lot of really hardworking people are in limbo at the moment, as always happens in a new term. But given how slow it seems to be going this time, there's a real danger for the government here that if they don't get on with things and start governing, you know, feed the beast or the beast will feed on you.
Yeah, no one think of the staff. Jason.
Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, has been talking a lot about productivity since the election, and I think he's getting ready to deliver a major address on that subject at the National Press Club in about 2 weeks from now. So it'll be interesting to see how he fleshes out that argument around the need to lift productivity. So that's coming up.
Laura.
On indulgence, Mr. Speaker, I feel like I've had more farewells than Nellie Melba this week. I'm leaving the gallery. It's been a really long time, but I think I'm leaving it in really good hands. There are so many really great young journos in the gallery. And all I would say is, as I said in my column this week, the government's got a once in a generation opportunity, not just because of the numbers, but because of the state of demise of the minor parties, in which I'd include the coalition at the moment, and just go for it on policy. People want to know, people want to understand, and people want to be informed on the details of policy. And the gallery is still the best place to do that and to quiz the government. So go for it.
Oh, we're going to miss you enormously from the gallery, Laura, and an enormous thank you for your huge contribution to political journalism. But we will see you back on this couch in your new role as Global Affairs Editor at the ABC, which is going to be fascinating as well. Can't wait to see what you do with it. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, we were reluctant to show Michael McCormack's most embarrassing moment yet again, but then he raised it himself, reflecting on his time as the Shadow Minister for International Development in the Pacific as he moved to the backbench. We'll leave you with this life lesson for visits to the Pacific. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, there was that little incident of Sakawa in the Federated States of Micronesia. That, I've learnt my lesson. Just sit, don't gulp.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.